Because Politifact ruled that an American Principles Project PAC advertisement was, quote, missing context, app is not able to run that video as a paid advertisement on Facebook, and Facebook, which uses Politifact as one of its third-party fact-checking organizations, actually will slap it with a, quote, fact-check label if app decides to post it to the platform. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. Here's why this story is important. App's ad is about the Equality Act. It's running in Michigan, and it's tying Senator Gary Peters and Joe Biden to the Equality Act's likely impact on women's sports. So the Equality Act is one of those pieces of legislation that would enable transgender identifying athletes to compete with the gender of their identity in sports. Now, App is saying that would, quote, destroy women's sports. That's a quote from this advertisement. There is a mountain of evidence, as well as just basic logic, to suggest that's absolutely accurate. Now, Politifact started doing its job and investigated the veracity of that claim. It pressed the American Principles Project PAC to provide responses to some counter arguments about whether the Equality Act would actually destroy women's sports. That's all normal. That's all part of the process. Nothing wrong so far. But when the American Principles Project PAC did supply those responses, ultimately Politifact said this was, quote, missing context, and that's what enabled Facebook to block the ad from running as a paid promotion. Now, App engaged. I obtained an email chain between App and Politifact, all the way up to the editor-in-chief. I obtained an email chain showing that the American Principles Project PAC, Terry Schilling, who's the executive director of the American Principles Project, he appealed the Politifact decision and provided 18 case studies in which similar rulings that allowed transgender identifying athletes to compete in with the gender identity of their choosing harmed women's sports or hurt female athletes. He supplied 18 examples, very specific, with details about the location, the name, the date, and the source. Everything, packaged it up really, really nicely. Everything's right there. He also included 3 ads. I think 2 of them were from the Lincoln Project, that he asked Politifact whether they were missing context. He sort of highlighted some obvious factual discrepancies and said, so if our ad is missing context, are these, and will they also be blocked from Facebook? He posed this question to Politifact. It's actually really fair. His responses, his back and forth with the reporter and the editors were perfectly polite and reasonable and made in good faith. And he supplied this ample evidence to support the prediction at the center of Politifact's issue with the ad, which, by the way, Politifact also just kind of punted and said that was a prediction it plainly couldn't fact check, even though its fact check is ruling that the prediction is missing context. So it did fact check it. But Politifact's editor-in-chief had no interest in engaging with Schilling. She sent him 2 very terse emails saying, basically, we reviewed the decision, we stand by it. Your appeal is rejected. And then when Schilling continued, she said, maybe you didn't understand me the first time. This is beyond your complaints. I'm rejecting it, basically. And so then I reached out with a request for comment as a journalist and asked the editor-in-chief of Politifact similar questions to Schilling. And I can read you the response that I got from her. She said, "Our story is complete and accurate, and the ad is most certainly missing context. I could expound on those points, but it is not necessary, so I have nothing more to add." So I have nothing more to add. That's how the Politifact editor-in-chief responds to a journalist seeking an explanation about its standards. And the reason those standards are important, this seems like maybe nitpicking one example, cherry-picking one example, and just really, maybe fixating disproportionately on one case study. But it's actually really important because Politifact is what Facebook relies on. And what we see from this is one of the third-party fact-checking organizations that Facebook relies on. And what we see in this example very clearly is that the organization, fact checkers are biased. We all know that. There's ample evidence of Politifact acting in a biased manner over the last 10 years at least. And you can go, and it goes all the way back to the Affordable Care Act debate. You can find evidence, and I link to evidence in my piece up on the Federalist today. It's there, but we're never going to remove bias from our fact checkers. But organizations, big tech organizations, Silicon Valley companies like Facebook should be aware that they need to address the issue of bias in the fact-checking industry if they're going to rely on the fact checkers to determine what is allowed on their platform. Because what is allowed on their platform is actually of huge consequence right now, given that both parties use Facebook as a huge platform for their advertising. Digital advertising is a huge part of campaigning in the presidential election and Senate elections. It's a really big deal now. So if Facebook is going to outsource the determinations about what ads are able to go live on the platform to these third-party fact checkers, they need to be prepared to deal with bias in the so-called fact-checking industry. This is why it's so important. And big tech really struggles with how they should set the boundaries of acceptable debate and acceptable news content. This is an important issue. This is a major trusted fact-checking organization acting in an unbelievably obtuse manner. I mean, this is them clearly showing a disinterest in transparency. So the missing context argument is fascinating, right? Because political ads, you can make an argument that every single one of them is missing context because they are partisan arguments. So any Democrat could say that any Republican ad is missing context, and any Republican can do the same. You can always make that argument because it's a partisan cause. So for Politifact to slap this ad with a missing context label that blocks it from Facebook promotions and gives it a fact-checking label is really laughable. That's the best way to put it. It's just completely laughable because everything's missing context. So the vagueness is one thing, but when you issue a vague ruling, you should at least be willing to explain your standards and to explain your methods. And Politifact then exhibited a complete disinterest in doing that. And that's what I think it should trouble Facebook about this story, is that Politifact treated its critics, by the way, a journalist acting in perfectly good faith. I sent a very, normal question over, a polite question over. Terry Schilling of App was engaging in perfectly good faith with Politifact. He was supplying a lot of evidence. He was going back and forth, and he was pushing. He sent a number of emails, but Politifact was dodging the questions and really just refusing to engage with them. So if you're going to issue a vague ruling that has consequence on something like what App says is a $4 million digital ad buy, that's a big problem if you're a fact-checking organization. So I've reached out to Facebook and asked whether they will be reevaluating their relationship with Politifact because of this ruling, which is blatantly biased, and because of their conduct throughout this back and forth, which shows they totally lack an interest in transparency. And, which is kind of critical if you're a fact-checking organization. I will absolutely update our readers if I hear back from Facebook, but this is a really sad case study, and it's one that should trouble Facebook as well as Facebook's users and people who want this platform to be an even playing field for both parties.